This documentary was made by Peyton Haviland, so get ready to learn. More specifically, get ready to learn about Anne Sullivan. She is an example of the NHD theme of breaking barriers in history for one specific reason. It was difficult to reach Helen Keller. She was blind, deaf, mute, and spoiled by her doting father, which all caused her to be ill-behaved. By breaking through these barriers and teaching Helen how to communicate, Anne Sullivan changed the way in which children with similar disabilities are taught. Anne Sullivan was born in Feeding Hills, Massachusetts on April 14, 1866. She was born to Irish immigrant parents, Thomas and Alice Sullivan. They emigrated from Ireland during the Great Famine. She also had 2 siblings and was the oldest of those siblings. Her birth name was actually Johanna Mansfield Sullivan, but everyone called her Anne or Annie. She was born into a poor family, making her childhood difficult. Anne Sullivan had to face and overcome many barriers in her childhood. She grew up in poverty and had many health problems. When she was 5, she got trachoma, an eye disease that is caused by bacteria. Because of her disease, she frequently had swollen and red eyes growing up, due to many painful infections. This disease actually affected her whole life because of the vision loss that it caused. Anne lost her mother when she was 8 due to tuberculosis and a serious fall, adding even more burdens and barriers to Anne's life. Her abusive father, Thomas, didn't think that he could handle his children alone, so he left them soon after the death of Anne's mother. Jimmy, Anne's younger brother, and her were sent to a home for the poor called the Tewksbury's Almshouse to live. Some believe that Anne's sister was sent to live with relatives, but nobody knows for sure. If something is going to show how terrible Anne's childhood was, it is this. Nobody really knows where her own sister went after her mother died and her father abandoned them. Maybe it was better if Anne's sister went to live with relatives because the conditions at the poorhouse were horrible. There were too many people, and overall, it was just disgusting. Because of these conditions, Jimmy died 4 months after moving to the house with a weak hip and conditions of tuberculosis. This deeply affected Anne because she was close to him. However, there were some positive impacts of the poorhouse on Anne's life. She got some short-term relief operations on her eyes. She actually took a position as a housemaid, but it did not turn out to be successful. And most importantly, Anne Sullivan learned about schools for the blind. She knew that her best way to get out of poverty was to get an education, so she made going to school a major priority in her life. Anne definitely did not have an easy childhood, but all of the barriers that she faced growing up resulted in her being a very strong person. When a commission was investigating the poorhouse, Anne got up the courage to tell one of the workers that she wanted to go to school. On October 7, 1880, she went to school at Perkins University. Anne was very different from her classmates because of all the barriers she had faced so far in her life. She didn't have very good social skills, could not read or write, had a quick temper, did not know some of the basics of life like sewing, and liked to break the rules. Some students and teachers did not like this and gave her a hard time because of it. However, she was extremely smart, and her embarrassment and anger from her childhood made her want to do very well in school. Also, some people were sympathetic and kind to Anne. For example, Mrs. Sophia Hopkins became like a mother figure to Anne. She was also very close with the school director, Michael Agnognos. She also befriended Laura Bridgman, who was actually the first deaf and blind person to learn how to communicate. This friendship may have been what caused Anne to be so patient and determined with Helen Keller. Anne ended up being the valedictorian of her class at Perkins. Her speech was actually pretty inspirational to many of her peers. Anne was scared that she would have nowhere to go after graduation, but just like that, fate, better known as Captain Keller of Alabama, called. During the summer of 1886, Captain Keller wrote Michael Anagnos asking for a recommendation of a teacher for his deaf and blind daughter Helen, who had not been able to see or hear since she was 19 months old. Anagnos knew that Anne Sullivan was very smart and determined, so he recommended her. Anne accepted the job and started studying the teaching methods that were used for Laura Bridgman. In the spring of 1887, Anne Sullivan moved to Tuscumbia, Alabama to begin her life with Helen Keller. She showed great maturity with the child. She kept her isolated from her family. She did this so that Helen could stay completely focused on learning and not have any distractions. Helen was also on a very strict schedule. She was a very stubborn and spoiled child, but no matter what, Anne did not give up. Not many people could deal with Helen, but Anne did. At first, Anne based her teachings mainly off of those done by Dr. Howe and Laura Bridgman, but then she got creative and unique in her teachings. This is when Anne truly started making her own extraordinary breakthroughs with Helen. Anne taught Helen in a couple of ways that made her teaching styles really distinctive and effective. The first one is how obedient she made Helen behave. She did not put up with Helen's tantrums and spoiledness and taught her discipline. She took Helen outside because research showed that this is a more interactive way to teach students. She used large amounts of repetition to get the information to stick well in Helen's brain. Anne made learning fun for Helen. For example, Anne tried to incorporate learning into what Helen enjoyed. Books were also a large part of Helen's lesson plans, and eventually really helped Helen learn. This is what truly made the teachings and broken barriers of Anne Sullivan more monumental on the deafblind community than Dr. Howe's teachings, because it was a much more personal way to teach. Finally, because of this new and productive approach and using fingerspelling on Helen's hand to represent objects, Helen caught on. This happened when one day, at the water well, Anne poured water on Helen's hand and spelled out water. That's when Helen connected the fingerspelling with the objects around her. It was a major breakthrough. Amazingly, in just a few months, Sullivan taught Helen nearly 600 words. She also taught her some multiplication tables as well as the Braille system. This news spread quickly, making Helen Keller quite famous. Anne Sullivan decided to take Helen to Perkins School for the Blind for further education. They stayed at the school for periods of time, as well as in Alabama for periods of time. Helen's speech was improved at White Humason School in New York City. Many people donated money to Anne and Helen to pay for Anne's salary and Helen's education. Helen went to Radcliffe College in 1900. Because of the numerous hours of work put in by Anne Sullivan of spelling out class lectures into Helen's hand and explaining textbook information to her, Helen was the first deafblind person to graduate from college. She was only able to achieve this because of Anne Sullivan. Anne Sullivan continued to help Helen Keller succeed throughout the rest of her life, including helping her make her autobiography. Anne Sullivan met John A. Macy while helping Helen Keller with her autobiography. He was a Harvard University instructor. He fell in love with Anne and asked her to marry him a couple of times before she finally said yes. They got married in 1905. Even though she was married, Anne and Helen were still extremely close, and their relationship was not affected by the marriage. Anne still helped Helen's career as much as she could. She traveled with her on lecture tours and helped Helen speak to audiences. Sadly, a little less than 10 years after the marriage, Anne and John broke up. They never got an official divorce, but they separated and John moved to Europe. Anne started to have health problems shortly after her marriage ended, so Polly Thompson became Helen's secretary. They, including all three of the women, eventually moved to Forest Hills, New York. Anne spent her last 15 years of life trying to make ends meet. She acted in a movie that ended up being unsuccessful. Helen and her toured the theater circuit where they told their story and amazed audiences. Anne lost most of her vision around the end of the 1920s. Her right eye caused her much pain, and eventually it was taken out. She visited Scotland for many of her last summers to try to restore some of her strength. In her home in Forest Hills, New York, Anne died on October 20th, 1936. Her ashes were placed in Washington, D.C. at the National Cathedral. Anne Sullivan broke many barriers in her lifetime, but there was specifically one major area of broken barriers in her life. There were so many times in her life that she could have given up. However, she continued to persevere and gave all that she could to Helen. And as a result, she broke through a barrier and taught a very stubborn, deafblind child who often had temper tantrums and didn't understand what was going on around her how to communicate in a way that was unique and worked for Helen. The story of the life of Anne Sullivan is truly inspiring, and it's always amazing to reflect back on her life and the gateway that she opened for deafblind children.
After her 7th lesson, she was able to speak the sentence word by word, I am not dumb now.
No.